There's no need to stand when I come in if you're more comfortable sitting. Entirely a matter for you.
Okay.
Can you hear okay?
No, he's changed my battery.
Ah.
Right, can you hear me now?
Can you say something else?
Can you hear me now?
Not as well as I could this morning.
And we won't start until we've sorted this out. So
something seems to have happened after he's changed my battery.
Okay.
I can hear myself, but I'm not getting the loop.
Don't worry, we'll get our technical person in.
It's just not. I can hear myself, but I'm just not getting the pickup I got this morning. Film 3, yeah?
Is that any better?
Okay.
Can you hear me now properly?
Better, yes. One more.
How about this?
What did you have for breakfast? Yes, that's good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Ah, good. All I was saying to you, so that there's no mystery about it, was there's no need, unless you want to do so, to stand up when I come in. Counsel will. That's because she performs the role she has standing. But if you're more comfortable sitting, that's fine.
So, Dr. Winter, we were talking about cryoprecipitate. One of the observations you made was that it was not suitable for home treatment. Now, I should say the inquiry has had evidence that cryoprecipitate was used for home treatment at Great Ormond Street, at Birmingham Children's Hospital, and we know it was used by Catherine Dormandy at the Royal Free. I can entirely see that it may have been, or the concentrate home treatment might be more straightforward, less laborious, and so on. But I think it's not right to say that it was impracticable or impossible to have cryoprecipitate as home treatment. Would you accept that?
But you had to have a deep freeze, and that was a problem.
Certainly Dr. Dormandy at the Royal Free made those arrangements for her patients.
Right.
Do you accept that cryoprecipitate posed a lower risk of infection for HIV and non-A, non-B hepatitis?
Yes, because it only came from, gave somebody 20 bags. That was exposure to 20 donors rather than to the 20,000 with an infusion of concentrate.
And you've explained why you thought cryoprecipitate was less clinically effective than concentrate. But would you agree that cryoprecipitate could be used, and indeed had been used, to raise factor VIII levels? And so it was clinically efficacious, even if it took longer or was a more laborious process than concentrate?
Yes, I've already stated that. It was just not as effective.
And then in terms of side effects, as I understand your evidence from before lunch, the side effects from cryoprecipitate that you were describing, that chills and shakes need to be monitored. So as you say, certainly not pleasant, but not long-term and serious side effects.
No, they were just transient, maybe lasting a few minutes, but they needed to be monitored.
You also suggested that cryoprecipitate couldn't be used in children, although I think your answer was young children. As we'll come on to see, but you've already made reference to, that the UK HCDO recommendation that emerged in the middle of 1983 did actually include a recommendation to use cryoprecipitate for children. So it was, as a matter of fact, something that could be used for children, I think.
Yes, it just had practical problems if the child was young, as you say.
And so we come essentially to a number of practical issues in relation to cryoprecipitate. It took longer, you might need a deep freeze, but if in hospital you would have that facility, but it would take longer, it would need medical staff. So those are practical disadvantages. But would you accept that one has to set against that the fact that it was safer? Why would the practical disadvantages outweigh the safety of the product?
But if you're moving towards why didn't we use cryo on everybody, I've already told you there was just no supply. Secondly, there would have been massive antipathy from the patients, and there would have been great reluctance from the doctors. I don't ever recall any haemophilia doctor ever suggesting in response at this critical moment that we should switch all patients to cryoprecipitate. I have no recollection of any haemophilia doctor thinking that that was a possible way forward. I think there was Dr. Ratnoff in Cleveland, I think he was always remembered as the one doctor who kept his patients on cryoprecipitate. But it was just not considered as a realistic option in this country.
Yes, I mean, we may hear some evidence at least to the contrary, but I understand that to be your understanding. In terms of supply, if there wasn't enough available for an immediate switch of everybody from concentrate to cryoprecipitate, would there have been enough to ration it so that cryoprecipitate was used for children and previously untreated patients or mild haemophiliacs?
Well, that's what UK HCDO was recommending, wasn't it? And that's what
Essentially.
happened at Guy's, to my recollection.
And would you agree that if there was a switch from reverting to cryoprecipitate instead of concentrate, there may have been an ability to catch up in terms of supply issues because you could utilise the plasma that would previously have been required for concentrate to make cryoprecipitate?
Well, that would only be the British plasma, obviously.
Yes.
Of which there wasn't very much.
What about the option of switching to cryoprecipitate for more patients on a temporary basis until more was known about the risk of AIDS or more known about the possibility of viral inactivation? Was that an option?
Isn't that the same thing as we've just been discussing?
Well, I think we've discussed using cryoprecipitate for children and the other categories identified in the UK HCDO
So in 1983, aren't we?
So in 1983.
Yeah.
What about using cryoprecipitate for a wider range of patients, including adults who are severely affected, as a temporary option? Was supply the only
Same
reason?
answers, I think, no supply. I mean, there was very little cryo around as far as I can recollection. At least the part of the world where I was working, it would have meant cessation of home therapy, patient reluctance, less efficacious, etc. I mean, safer. I'm not denying the importance of that, but it just didn't seem an option to it for all those reasons.
Do you recall whether you had or your colleagues at Guy's at this time had any discussions with patients to offer them cryoprecipitate?
No.
As in, no, you can't recall, or you didn't have.
No, I can't recall.
I think you've already told us that no patient positively asked you to go back on asked if they could go back on cryoprecipitate.
No.
If they had, this is a hypothetical question, but if they had, what would your response have been?
Well, I would have talked it through with them. I mean, if they were very, very concerned about going on with concentrate, if I could have got guaranteed supplies of cryoprecipitate, if they understood the implications of what that decision meant in terms of having to come into hospital each time they had a bleed, which is quite a significant thing, then I would certainly have had an open discussion with them. But our recommendation was, as we've been discussing, to introduce these restrictions to these particular sort of subgroups of patients who we could get away from concentrate, to express our anxiety about the situation and the lack of apparent progress towards self-sufficiency. I mean, of course, I am still a trainee at this time.
Yes.
So I don't have any managerial authority or anything. and that was really as far as we could go.
You may not know the answer to this, Dr. Winter, but in terms of cost, and leave aside for one moment the practical question that there may have been supply issues in relation to the Tooting Centre, in terms of cost, do you know whether cryoprecipitate was, to the health authority, more expensive or cheaper than factor concentrates?
Oh, much cheaper.
And then can I ask you just a little about commercial versus British concentrates?
May I just
So, yes.
ask this? Did any patient, later on, when you were a consultant, did any of the patients whom you treated who were young, that is, children who were having cryoprecipitate in accordance with the guidelines, or mild, early affected and having it in accordance with the guidelines, or first just newly diagnosed, did any of them say to you, well, look, these other people we've come across, they get this factor concentrate to keep in their fridge at home. Can I have some of that?
No, they didn't. I mean, as I stressed, this was a very small centre with very small numbers of children only, but none of the patients approached me with that sort of conversation. And I can't recall at this distance of time. I mean, I can remember using cryoprecipitate in a child, but I can't remember. My recollection is that most of them we were able to secure BPL concentrate, and that's the way we treated them, and we advised them to only use it for times when it was absolutely necessary, and we didn't have prophylaxis programs going in children, so we suspended prophylaxis, so it was only given for episodes of significant bleeding.
And then the question of commercial versus British concentrates, your statement says, and your evidence has been clear, that in terms of concentrates, BPL concentrate was your treatment of choice. Was the reason for that your understanding that it was, relatively speaking, safer than commercial concentrates?
Yes, because I've been signed up for a long time, well, really during all my time as a trainee, to a firm belief that if you had factor VIII that was derived from a pool of voluntary donors, it was wherever those donors lived, it was going to be much safer than if the concentrate was derived from a pool of paid donors, for obvious reasons, because the voluntary donors were giving it through altruism and the paid donors were doing it because they needed the money and they were therefore much likely to have alcohol and drug problems and therefore much more likely to be carriers of viruses.
Other than safety, were there any other advantages or disadvantages of British product over commercial product?
No, I mean, we had obviously wished, as the situation was in Scotland, to be entirely self-sufficient in what would have been English factor VIII. That's what we wanted. But that was the only consideration. We wanted that because it was safer.
Were you aware at this time that in the United Kingdom there was still collection of blood from prisoners?
In the US?
No, in the United Kingdom.
No.
Can I ask you just to clarify one point in your witness statement, Dr. Winter, before I move to a next topic? It's paragraph 23C of your witness statement. You just have the hard copy.
Could I ask you to get the audio person back? I'm still not picking you up.
Certainly. We'll just pause there.
Just not picking up to any degree. I can hear there's some amplification of me, but I can't hear Jenny. I mean, I can't see any amplification from Jenny.
You're on the same setting on the
Yes.
server this morning. You can hear Jenny, did you say?
I can hear my own voice amplified, but not Jenny's. That sounds more promising. Could you just say hello?
Hello, is that any better?
Much better.
Good.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to check one point in your witness statement to see that I've correctly understood it. It's paragraph 23 of your witness statement. And at paragraph 23C, you say, as I believe that all of the available commercial concentrates were of equal clinical efficacy and safety, my main responsibility was then to purchase coagulation factor concentrates at the most advantageous price. As I understand that, you're not saying that commercial concentrates were of equal safety to British concentrate. You're saying that as between the various different commercial concentrates, you weren't aware of anything to pick and choose between them. Is that right?
That's correct in terms of both efficacy and safety.
Thank you. Before we get to you being a consultant, which I promise we will get to, I just wanted to ask you a handful of questions about UKHCDO and its decisions and actions during this period. So if we go first, please, Henry, to CBLA 301619. We can see these are the minutes of a UKHCDO meeting on the 13th of September 1982. If we go to the bottom of the second page, please, Henry. We can see towards the very bottom that you're there in place of Dr. Barkham, and Dr. Barkham was represented by you and apologies had been received from him. This was, I think, the first UKHCDO directors meeting that you attended, and you attended at this stage not as a director, but still as a registrar.
That's correct.
And then if we go, please, to page 10, Henry. We can see that AIDS was discussed, it's the bottom of page 10. It said that the reference centre directors had asked Dr. Crass to look into the report from the United States of this syndrome, mainly in homosexuals, but including 3 haemophiliacs. It appeared that there was a remote possibility that commercial blood products had been involved. Dr. Crass asked the directors to let him know if they had any cases of the syndrome. The Working Party was considering the implications of the reports from the USA. So that's the sum total of the discussion on AIDS as recorded in those minutes. First of all, what, if anything, do you recall of that meeting?
Nothing, but I obviously, interestingly, reading the words there and look at it, I mean, the phrase remote possibility doesn't seem the best of phrasing, does it? I certainly would not have used that phrase at all, because it seemed to me that by this stage you would have to use a phrase like it was considered a significant possibility that these patients had been infected by an agent in blood products.
So that's September 82 when you're there. Now I'm going to go now to a meeting which I know you weren't at, Dr. Winter. It's HCDO 503_008, please, Henry. No? 19th of... Sorry, I'll just get an alternative reference, forgive me. It's the 13th of May meeting. 1983. We'll see if we can find a different reference for that, Dr. Winter. But let me tell you what it was. It was a meeting of reference centre directors at St Thomas's on the 13th of May 1983 to discuss AIDS. Could I ask you whether you have any reflection on the lapse of time between September 1982, the meeting we've just looked at, and there not being a special meeting to discuss this until May of 1983? Do you think that can show sufficient urgency on the part of reference centre directors?
Well, of course, this was an organisation that I didn't belong to at that time. Seems to me that if my memory is correct, it was the end of 1982 that we had the San Francisco baby,
Yes.
which was important sort of additional information in addition to the 3 original American cases. We would have had a small number of further American cases. We didn't get the first British case until May 83, I think, in Cardiff.
It was publicly reported in May of 83. We've seen evidence to suggest that the patient presented to Professor Bloom in Cardiff in March of 83.
Yes. I mean, looking back, I just don't know what drove them to schedule the meetings in that way. I mean, the haemophilia directors, now known as comprehensive care, is a pretty small community. And we, outside of the meetings, we all in touch with each other pretty closely, or most of each other. So for all I know, there may have been quite a lot of telephone dialogue going on about the evolving situation, but I obviously don't know why they didn't meet again until May, which here's the document now,
Yes.
now in front of me.
Well, that's fair enough, Dr. Winter. Can we then look at the document that you did become aware of, which was the recommendation sent out after this meeting in June of 1983? I'm hoping this is the right reference, Henry. HCDO 000270_004. So after that meeting in May, this letter was sent by Professor Bloom and Dr. Ritzer. You'll see it's dated the 24th of June 1983. And you can see, if we just scroll down a little, general recommendations. 1, for mildly affected patients with haemophilia A or von Willebrand's disease and minor lesions, treatment with DDAVP should be considered because of the increased risk of transmitting hepatitis by means of large pool concentrates in such patients. This is in any case the usual practice of many directors. And that reflected the practice at Guy's.
It did.
And then for treatment of children and mildly affected patients or patients unexposed to imported concentrates, many directors already reserve supplies of NHS concentrates, brackets cryoprecipitate or freeze-dried, and it would be circumspect to continue with this policy. So the recommendation is cryoprecipitate or NHS factor concentrate for those categories.
Which is what we're already implemented.
At Guy's at this stage.
Yeah.
You may or may not have a view on this, Dr. Winter, but this is voiced as general recommendations, and what we see in paragraph 1 and 2 is, well, this is the practice generally, circumspect to continue is the language of paragraph 2. It falls short of being an instruction or firm advice. It's to some extent leaving it to clinical judgment. Would you agree?
Yes, it's interesting to reflect on this. Medicine now is different to medicine then, and there was a great store then, the famous phrase, clinical freedom, the ability of a doctor to look at some guidelines and say, I'm going to do something totally opposite to that because I have clinical freedom, a very dangerous concept. And I think, therefore, for some doctors at that time, these documents were seen as advisory, but not binding. I think now, the word protocol, which is not mentioned here, we don't well, when I was working, we didn't have advisory documents, we had protocols. And it was generally agreed that once the haemophilia directors had issued a protocol to the UK HCDO members, they were on dangerous ground if they deviated from that and something went wrong with the patient. So this was, this moved from being a guidance, which is advisory, over the course of the next 30 years to being essentially a strongly recommended protocol, which was produced by experts and you were expected to follow it. And if you didn't follow it, then that might be a problem.
And then we'll move from June 1983 to October 1983. Henry, could we have PRSE 304440, please? So we can see this is a meeting of the directors on the 17th of October 1983. And if we go down, we can see, actually, leave it, if you leave it there, Henry, that's great. I don't know whether you see, if you go down in alphabetical order, the list of attendees, we have, beneath Dr. Chisholm, Dr. K.G.A. Clark, Guy's Hospital, London. That's the other consultant.
That is the case. He is not a haemophilia specialist.
And then if we could go to page 10, please, Henry. We can see under the heading Any Other Business, bottom half of the page, Dr. Chisholm raising the problem of patients refusing to take up commercial factor VIII concentrate because of the AIDS scare. She wondered, in view of the worry of the patients, whether the directors could revert to using cryoprecipitate for home therapy. And then this is Professor Bloom's response. He felt that there was no need for patients to stop using the commercial concentrates because at present there was no proof that the commercial concentrates were the cause of AIDS. Would you agree with this, that to await proof before taking action in circumstances where the link, although not proven, is pretty clear, is the wrong course to take?
Well, we're only a few months away from the events of April and May 1984, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, where exactly that situation arose. And together with some other doctors, I did have to make very radical changes to therapy on theoretical considerations alone.
Because you have told us you were pretty satisfied, and as far as you're concerned, most haemophilia clinicians were pretty satisfied at the beginning of 1983 that blood products were the cause of, were the relevant transmissible agent.
Well,
and yet here's Professor Bloom saying, well, there's no need to stop using concentrates. And the reason he gives, not supply or anything else, the reason he gives is no proof. Would you agree that's the wrong question for him to have been posing, or the wrong answer for him to be given at that time?
When I've done these inquiries, one of the difficulties is being asked to explain why other doctors said and did something.
You are right. I think this is a question ultimately for me to evaluate. What Council is doing, I think, is finding out what the views were of different clinicians as to what the answer should be, although ultimately it's one which I will have to decide. So it's helpful. You have, I think the background to this is you've just described the word remote possibility. The word remote used several months before this as being misplaced, and significant would be better. You have indicated that you understood there was a real risk. Leave aside the question of certainty. The question might be put this way: is a significant or real risk a proper ground for action? You've said it was for yourself a year later, or a few months later, when you had to consider what action to take in advance of there being definite proof of cause and effect.
I mean, of course, if I may say so, I stress, this has been a very long conversation. You're talking now about what interactions I had with other haemophilia doctors. I didn't have any. I wasn't a consultant. I was not part of UK HCDO. I was not having regular dialogues with other haemophilia treaters around the country because I didn't know them because I was a trainee. So all this will change in a minute when I eventually do get to be appointed as a consultant. But if I've been rather vague with my answers for this last couple of hours, it's because, you know, I was in a little bubble at Guy's Hospital working as a senior registrar, and I was not part of the UK HCDO network, and I can't tell what interactions they were having at their level, but presumably by telephone and informal meetings.
I understand that. Now, we know that the next document or set of recommendations issued by UK HCDO was in December of 1984. And I know you've got some observations you want to make about that document, but what I'll do is come back to that when you've explained the decisions and actions you took in the course of 1984, so we can look at it in that context. Can I just ask this, though? You've talked about the status of UK HCDO recommendations. If, and this is hypothetical, but if the Chief Medical Officer had issued guidance, for example, guidance saying clinicians should no longer use imported concentrates or clinicians should revert to using cryoprecipitate, would you expect that, would you have expected to follow guidance from the Chief Medical Officer?
I think it became a very significant issue as we, over the next few years, dealing with all these very spectacular problems, the lack of very, what you might call powerful, influential, centralized advice. We're going to talk about this when we talk about how to tell patients they've got HIV, how to test them, and so on and so on. There were many of these issues, and it was made a lot more difficult to cope with at local level as a consultant trying to respond to these spectacularly difficult problems, that there was no central body that had published very clear, firm guidance or protocol, or call it well you will, to haemophilia doctors saying, this is what we think you should do in this situation. And, you know, this is why one of the key things for me in the whole epidemic is the variability word, and all these things we've already been speaking about of each doctor having the freedom to do what he wanted. And that was just one of the very, very major difficulties that emanated out of a very clear diktat, let's use a proper word, from somewhere powerful and central saying, this is what you should do. And we really lacked that, particularly when HIV broke. We were blood specialists, haemophilia doctors, not virologists, dealing to day-to-day basis with the problems caused by a virus, of which we were not specialists. So I think that point you're raising is a really core one. We very much lacked firm central guidance from whatever body, you know, a body set up for national virological advice or the chief medical officer or whatever.
And you, I infer from your answers, would have welcomed such guidance,
Yes.
whether it was from the CMO or others?
Yes.
Because what you've described is a situation in which you, as a registrar with your fellow registrars, in a centre in which the two consultants are not specialists in this field, are having to take your own decisions.
Well, yes, I mean, we had the UK HCDO guideline, which we'd followed, about how to minimise concentrate usage. But apart from that, yes.
Can I just ask you one further question about UK HCDO, and not at any one point in time, but in the knowledge that you are about to become a member in the end of 1983, when you become a director in Kent. Professor Savage, who you obviously dealt with quite extensively over the following months and years, in his evidence to the Archer inquiry, was very critical of UK HCDO. He said it was run pretty much as a club by the 10 or so main players. And there was something of an information vacuum for directors in particular of smaller centres. Would you agree with that based upon your own experience once you became a director?
I don't agree with that. I think we should state UK-HCDO was generally regarded by the other haemophilia societies and doctors in other countries as actually being a model of its kind. There isn't really any other country where haemophilia doctors came together and collaborated to such an extent that every patient with an inherited blood disease in the country was registered. We knew the number of patients with the condition, we knew the severity of the condition, we knew whether they had an inhibitor, we knew whether they were on home treatment, we knew whether they were alive or dead. No other country had information like this. And every time you went to a World Federation meeting, people would say, you know, your system you have in the UK is light years of what we have in our country. We have nothing like it. And then in addition to that, as we've seen already, it was a very active organisation. In addition to all the day-to-day work we were doing, at any one time there'd be 6, 7, 8 working parties in specialist areas. So I thought the UK-HCDO was a very good thing. Of course, there were personalities involved, of which Professor Savage was a large one.
Okay. So we've finally, Dr. Winter, reached December 1983 when you took up your appointment in Kent as the centre director and consultant haematologist. Could you just describe what the services were when you arrived in Margate at the Haemophilia Centre?
Well, very unsatisfactory, really. They were very, although it was a centre and covering a very wide geographical area and with quite a good number of patients, there was no proper centre as such. It was just a haematology department. There was a particularly unsatisfactory state of affairs in that the patients got factor VIII on prescription from a general practitioner. And it wasn't clear to me how this completely inappropriate system had come about. But what that meant was when the patient needed factor VIII, they went off to a GP who wrote a prescription, please issue 10 bottles of factor VIII. And they went to a local pharmacy who had never heard of factor VIII but looked it up and found somebody who would sell it at an inflated price, doubtless. And the particular and very, very unsatisfactory aspect to all this was that, of course, no batch numbers were taken. So when I took over, I had no information whatsoever as to what people had been receiving over the years. And that became critical when over the months to come, as HIV broke, UK-HCDO would start circulating to all haemophilia treaters details of contaminated batches. You would get a letter saying, we now know that the following batches a patient's got HIV. Please let us know if your patients have received that batch. And I couldn't tell them because I had absolutely no records at all. So that was one of my top priorities, was to get rid of that completely inappropriate system.
We'll just look at a couple of documents in relation to that, if we may, Dr. Winter, just to illuminate that. HCDO 40/174_009, please. So we can see this is 7th of February 1984, and it's a letter that you wrote to Miss Spooner at the Oxford Haemophilia Centre. You say that you've recently replaced Dr. Harold Sterndale as director. You enclose the annual returns. And then you say this, you'll note, I've not been able to give you any information about material used in the home treatment of our haemophiliac patients. I understand that there was a serious lack of local funding a few years ago, and for these reasons an arrangement was made whereby all haemophiliacs on home treatment received factor VIII concentrate from their general practitioners on prescription. And then you explain that you're extremely unhappy about that and taking every step you can to abolish it and issue factor VIII directly. And then you're afraid you've no data on the type or amount of factor VIII that was used by our haemophiliacs on home treatment. And if we just look at the returns...
Can we just point out that she is the secretary of UK-HCDO, which at that time was based in Oxford and subsequently moved to Manchester.
Yes, we've seen that from other documents, thank you. And then... if we could have, please, Henry, HCDO 5 zeros, 174 underscore 003, please. HCDO 0000174 underscore 003. Oh, I'm sorry, I've given you too many zeros. HCDO 0000174 underscore 003. Thank you, you're there. So we can see this is the annual return for 1983. For Margate, your name is there. This is in relation to haemophilia B. Total number of patients treated during the year 3. And then we can see that you've been able to give a figure for the total used at hospital, whether inpatient or outpatient, and that it's NHS factor 9 concentrate. And no commercial factor 9 concentrate has been used at the hospital, but you're not able to give any figures for home treatment. It's nil because you don't have the data.
Yes, it's useful to see this because it gives everybody an idea of the way in which the Oxford returns every January or February. All haemophilia doctors would sit down and submit information about the previous year's treatment. These are patients with haemophilia B,
Yes.
not A.
Yes, we'll look
But
at
the haemophilia A would look very similar to
yes,
that.
and we've got that. Henry, it's the same, but it's 004 at the end, please. So HCDO 4 zeros, 174 underscore 004.
And then in addition to this, each patient is registered with Oxford, has a unique identification code, so there'll be a separate piece of paperwork to do where for every registered patient you would provide agreed information along the lines of have they had treatment, are they still alive, have they developed an inhibitor, etc.
Yes, and then we can see again, if we look at the column, we've got at the top, we've got total number of haemophilia A patients treated during the year 25. And then we can see for the haemophilia A patients, for inpatient or outpatient treatment, so treatment at the hospital, there's 48,750 units there of NHS factor 8. And then we can see the figure for commercial factor 8 at 16,320 of cryobilin. But in terms of home treatment, you've put nil and then you've put amount unknown for the reason you've given, because the home treatment system was being done through the GP and local pharmacists.
These are tiny amounts,
Yes.
less than 5% of the usage, I would think. So, nearly everything has gone through a general practitioner.
And so that system, and I appreciate entirely, it's not a system for which you were responsible, and it's a system which you were horrified by. But that meant that either a GP, not a specialist, or a pharmacist, not a clinician, was determining what actual product the haemophiliac patient had for their home treatment.
It was not the GP at all, who had also not heard of factor 8. He wouldn't have known anything about factor 8, or even if it came in different types. It was all down to the pharmacist, who also had not heard of factor 8, who went and looked it up in a book and found there were suppliers, and for whatever reason chose one of the suppliers and rang them up and said, how much is a bottle of factor 8? Whereas most haemophilia centres would have been ordering several hundred bottles at a go. They must have been highly amused at a commercial company to have a local pharmacist ring up and ask to buy 10 bottles of factor 8, but that's what happened.
And is this a correct inference to draw that the patients who would have been receiving their factor 8 in this way would have been receiving exclusively commercial concentrates, because the pharmacist wouldn't have access to the regional transfusion centre supply?
That's correct. This is a reflection of what we've been talking about earlier, the great shortage of Elstree, BPL in the South West Thames and South East Thames regions, and therefore the need to buy commercial.
It's probably clear from the letter you wrote to Miss Spooner, but would you agree that this was a completely inappropriate way to manage the care of the patients at the centre?
Well, it wasn't any form of management at all. It was anti-management.
Now, you then arrived in December of 1983, and at that point, as consultant, the decision as to which form of treatment to use or which particular product to use was yours. your witness statement says that it's the ultimate responsibility of the local trust. Can I just ask what you mean by that? Do you mean you're an employee of the health authority and in that sense it's the trust's responsibility?
Yes, I mean, the ultimate responsibility lay with me, really, as the clinician. It was solely my decision as to which type of concentrate a patient received. And that for the first 3 or 4 months of my consultancy, until we move on in a minute to talk about heat treatment, was basically a situation where there was very little Elstree available. So I was also, of course, continuing to follow the same recommendations that we've been implementing at Guy's about moderating concentrate usage for this first 3 or 4 months in early 1984. And then for the other regular severely affected patients, I was having to purchase commercial factor VIII.
The source of NHS concentrate for you in Margate, would it still have been Tooting? Or it was? You are now a consultant and therefore had a status you hadn't had at Guy's, and indeed a responsibility that you perhaps hadn't had at Guy's. Did you raise the question of the shortfall or inadequate supply of NHS concentrate with anyone at the Tooting Regional Transfusion Centre or in the blood transfusion service?
I think something very influential happened. Dr. Savage, as he was then, rang me up very, very early in my consultancy, and he said, I think we need to meet and to talk, which was extremely helpful. And I remember going to meet him at St Thomas's very, very shortly after I started. And we actually, rather than talking about shortage of BPL, what we spoke about at that meeting were the double problems. What were we going to do about the new disease, which seemed to be in the blood supply? What were we going to do about chronic liver disease? And we actually immediately, most of our conversation was, could we get heat treatment? And we're just about to come on to talk about that, but he was extremely helpful and influential in persuading me as to the right way forward over the next few months. And because, if you like, we were very hopeful of, we'd accepted that Tooting was never going to be able to come up with any improvement. This had been a very long-running saga, and as I say, at really all aspects of their operation. You know, we'd have situations in the hospital where we would ring up Tooting at night for emergency supplies and be told, oh, we're very short. There was a chronic shortage of all blood and blood products from Tooting because of this situation where they were covering the two health authorities. So we didn't think there was any mileage in trying to get more supplies of Elstree. By January, that there was so much of concern that we were already at that stage talking, the two of us, asking ourselves, can we get inactivated factor VIII? Because that's going to be the way forward.
Now, in the period from December 1983 until May 1984, when you you started to use the heat-treated product, are you able to give us any idea, on a very rough basis, what the percentage was of NHS versus commercial that you were using for your patients?
Well, as you've seen from the previous year, there was hardly any Elstree reaching Margate. The supplies were so limited. There was a feeling, of course, in the provinces that it all went into central London and that we were an afterthought. But this, I can only reflect that we had very, very little BPL, as the previous year's returns show.
So is it fair to say that probably the majority of the treatment was commercial concentrates?
Nearly all of it.
Where you were using
for that
factor
first 3 or 4
concentrates?
months when I was in post.
You told the Penrose inquiry that I can take you to it if need be, but I'll just summarise, and if you don't remember and want to look at it, we will. You told the Penrose inquiry that patients didn't want to have American concentrate, or some patients didn't want to, and you say it took quite a bit of work to persuade patients in some cases to continue to receive commercial concentrate. Do you want to look at the passage?
No. So now this is really now one of the next of a number of absolute key points in the epidemic.
So I wanted to ask that process you talk of persuading patients to continue to receive commercial concentrate. What time are you talking there about the heat-treated concentrate?
Well, I wasn't sure whether you were talking about. Are you talking about before we switched to heat treatment, about carrying on with?
Yes,
commercial?
I really just wanted to know that,
Yeah.
that description of persuading patients in some cases to continue to receive commercial concentrate. What time period does that relate to?
Well, in my experience, the whole history was haemophilia patients from the moment of their diagnosis and growing up and going to meetings learnt that one of the sort of key things to follow was that people used to say to them in the Sunday morning meeting in a haemophilia society seminar in wherever, when you get back to your centre, you want to make sure that you get British factor 8. Don't ever get American factor 8. Very early on in the haemophilia experience, the patient would have that message from somebody. It's a family illness, other people, a cousin or somebody, or an auntie might have said, you make sure. All the patients knew, and in my experience, whether it's this period, January 84, or at a time a few months later when we're trying to persuade people to switch, people were very, very reluctant, completely understandably, they were right, to have factor 8 from commercial donors.
And the reason, I'm really just interested in your use of the verb persuade. What was the reason why you were trying to persuade patients to do so?
Well, before the switch, because it was the only factor 8 I had, because I didn't have any Elstree, and as we've discussed, I didn't want to go back to cryoprecipitate.
And then for this first few months of your consultancy, was it the case that you were still trying to treat in accordance with the UK HCGO recommendation
Yes.
from the June of the previous year?
Yes.
So for children, for newly diagnosed, for mildly affected patients, would you be trying to use NHS concentrate?
Try to use NHS,
prioritising?
use DDAVP where appropriate, try and postpone surgery if it wasn't necessary, use BPL for children, maybe cryo for an older child if it was possible. Do all you can to restrict concentrate usage for children and mildly affected patients.
And was there any prophylactic programme during these first few months?
No,
in
not
Kent?
at that time.
So just given that there had been this previous rather unsatisfactory situation of the GP and the pharmacist, could you just talk us briefly through what you then did? Did you call this is again before heat treatment,
Yeah.
Did you call every patient in or invite every patient for an appointment and explain that the situation was going to now be different?
Yes, I mean, when patients come in to a haemophilia centre and they get supplies, they get enough for a couple of months, say. On this very inappropriate system, the 10 bottles they were given might only last them a week or something. So the patients were having to get prescriptions very regularly, so they ran out very quickly. So it was actually pretty easy to send for them to say, I need to talk to you about what's going to happen in the future. I've got a better system. We're going to give you the factor 8 from the hospital and you don't need to go to the GP anymore.
And given that the time frame we're talking about is end of 1983, early 1984, in the course of that conversation that you're having with your patients, because you're changing the way in which they receive their treatment, did you tell your patients anything about the risks from commercial concentrates in terms of either AIDS or non-A, non-B hepatitis?
Well, I certainly, in a very major way, did, as we're coming on to talk about in April and May. And these patients had not been particularly well informed about haemophilia, really, let alone its treatment. I think because I was already in discussion with Dr. Savage, my priority, I had a highly inappropriate, dangerous system. My priority was to get a proper haemophilia treatment program going with dispensation, that's the wrong word, dispensing being done from a hospital rather than a GP and a pharmacy. So my priority was to get the patients onto a system where they collected from us, and I thought, let me do that first of all, and then I can talk to the patient about a range of things. There was hardly any home therapy I wanted to do, there was no prophylaxis I wanted to do, and the major thing bubbling under was, are we about to switch to heat treatment?
So in those first few months, is it right to understand from your answer that you wouldn't necessarily have been telling your patients as a matter of routine about the risks of AIDS and non-A, non-B hepatitis?
I didn't start till the 12th of December, so by the time, Christmas, and then most of these patients I'd never met, and they were coming in for reviews once every couple of months or so, by which time I was well on the way to trying to switch.
And then you've told us, I think, of some of the initiatives of trying to implement the UK HCDO recommendations, and you mentioned possibly delaying surgery, not having prophylactic treatment until you can sort the situation out. Was the giving of advice about how to manage the condition through lifestyle changes, through rest, was that ever part of the conversation at that point in time?
Yeah, to be honest, I was starting from scratch there. I didn't have a haemophilia nurse, I didn't have a physio, I didn't have a centre, I didn't have a finance manager, I didn't have a secretary, I didn't have a centre. And all my patients were getting factor VIII from a GP. I mean, you couldn't have started from a lower position. So I started, and also, as if that wasn't enough, I was immediately into a situation where I knew there were two really serious issues, which was really also at the core of my thinking. So I had a whole range of really important priorities about, firstly, establishing, in effect, for quite a lot of patients coming in from all over Kent, for the first time, a proper centre. So, and there was just me. So there were a whole range of priorities I had to do first. By then it's springtime. By then we're into heat treatment.
And just in terms of the numbers of patients that we're talking about, I think we saw a number on the return. Your statement had estimated about 20 or so severe haemophiliacs.
I think
haemophilia A.
I think that's right. We had a sort of hub and spoke, so I did also look after patients in adjacent centres. They would go for day-to-day treatment to Medway or Maidstone or places like that, and then they would come to me for reviews as a haemophilia specialist. So in all, I'm thinking about 35 patients with significant haemophilia, and I say that because those were the patients who were coming on later in the year to get HIV tested.
And then, if we just look at your witness statement, again, please, Dr. Winter, paragraph 35(4). You say this: at this highly critical time, there were therefore only 3 options for haemophilia clinicians. Suspend treatment. I'm sorry, I'll wait. Do you have that?
Yep.
My apologies. So your option 1 was suspend treatment completely.
Yep.
Your option 2 was to continue with BPL concentrate only. And your option 3 was to switch to heat-treated factor 8 and 9. Now, we know you opted for option 3, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Just wanted to ask whether the position was truly as stark as you there set out, because presumably it wouldn't just be, you wouldn't have to suspend all treatment. You could reduce the amount of treatment, suggest, try and use a little bit more cryoprecipitate, give advice about management and bed rest on a temporary basis at least. Was it a more nuanced set of options than this perhaps suggests?
No. Nobody ever gave bed rest to a person with haemophilia. They're bleeding and they need to have the bleeding stopped. With hepatitis C, we know you almost certainly got hepatitis C the first time you had a treatment. So the viral risk from one treatment might have been the same as from 30 treatments. So where was the logic in trying to reduce treatment? You know, you were still going to give the treatment that had the virus. So there was no logic there. So it really did seem those, as a matter of strategic principle, those were the three core choices that lay in front of us.
And so could you then talk us through your reasoning for taking what was, I think, could fairly be characterised as a bold decision in the spring of 1984 to use heat-treated products?
Yes, this is one of the absolute key moments in the history of the epidemic. We'll have heard on the documentary and other things, there was a certain view retrospectively from some people with haemophilia, why did I have to continue to have factor VIII? Couldn't I have stopped? Haemophilia clinicians like me were very unhappy about that suggestion. Cerebral bleeding has always been the most common cause of death in haemophilia. I think in that year there'd already been 10 deaths from cerebral bleeding in haemophilia. These are things, of course, the patients don't see unless it happens to their family relative. That's the sort of thing that the doctors see. If you look at the Birch report of the early 1930s, an American doctor, I think, she looked at life expectancy of patients with severe haemophilia. Of course, there was no treatment. Nearly all the patients were dead by the age of 21, 22. The World Federation of Haemophilia have a twinning system, and every 2 years at the World Federation, a centre like ours from a developed world would get twinned with a developing centre. And we became twinned with Islamabad in Pakistan, who we went to see. They were nuclear power, but they had no factor VIII at all, nothing. And on the first day, we did a clinic for about 50 children, all of whom got carried in by their fathers, unable to walk. And at the end of the day, I said to the centre director from Islamabad, well, tomorrow, presumably, we can go and do a clinic at the adult centre. And he just looked at me and said, there isn't one. We don't need one. All of these children will die of bleeding. So the natural history of haemophilia, untreated, is to die of bleeding. So you'd never get a clinical doctor like me to sign up to a situation where I said to a patient, why don't you stop having factor VIII for a bit? Bleeding is a very, very serious issue. As I keep on saying, it's the most potent bleeding disorder known to man. So that was the easiest of the three options. It was absolutely not an option not to treat. So that was the easy bit. Now we come to the really hard bit. For years I reflected on this very difficult time and thought it was the hardest decision I ever had to make as a doctor. So let me just try and walk you through what the issues were. Firstly, we have the patients, British good, American bad. So the choice is, you can stay on British factor VIII. It's from voluntary donated plasma, good. It's got a full product license, good. It's cheap, good. The patients like it, good. But there's no inactivation step. Surely you have to believe that this new virus, which it had been identified by then, and we better make the point, in mid-1983, the French and then the American groups had identified the virus that we now know as HIV. So we knew that we were dealing with a virus. We just didn't have a test for it. So that was the big but. Did you believe, with increasing numbers of cases, still not very many, did you believe that the new virus would only be present in American factor VIII, or could it be possibly there also in British factor VIII? So that was the British choice. Or did you say to yourself, people with haemophilia are so vulnerable, the batches are from 20,000 donors. If one of those donors has a virus, the patient's likely to get it. They're incredibly vulnerable to any virus. Therefore, if I go for American, not liked by the patients, 50% more expensive, no license, but it's heated. Now, there was experimental evidence. The companies had started to bring in heat-treated factor VIII to try and see if it inactivated hepatitis before anything was known about AIDS. So the companies in the US had started to work on heat inactivation. In 1983, the Germans had a heat-treated product, Behring, but we were not able to get that. So that was the choice. So, and I sat down with the patients and said, I'm not happy about no treatment. This is a really, really difficult call. And again, I stress, I owe a debt of gratitude to Dr. Savage, who was very, very clear and strong that he thought we ought to switch, everybody, both factor VIII and factor IX. By February 1984, one of the companies, Alpha, who had a plant in Norfolk, the American company, they had a license in the US for the heat-treated product. That was a major step forward. And Dr. Savage and I approached them together with 2 other doctors in Britain and said, we're aware of this license in the US. Do you think you'd be able to get supplies for us, which we would have to give on a named patient basis? So you understand, if a drug doesn't have a license, doctors in this country still have the ability to use a drug on a named patient basis. And the answer was, yes, we can. It's going to be 50% more expensive. So we decided that was the route we really ought to go down, because we were so very concerned, for all the reasons we've discussed this morning, that HIV, we now had a virus. We couldn't convince ourselves that it wasn't going to be in British factor VIII as well as American, because of the intrinsic vulnerability of the system. There was very widespread disagreement with those views, and I'm never critical. You can ask the other doctors who are coming who didn't go down that pathway. The arguments against were, some people believed, including Professor Bloom, the chairman, that this was a problem to do with commercial factor VIII. The whole virus story, non-A, non-B, HIV, it was commercial. Terrible donor practices. It was not going to happen to Britain with altruistic voluntary donors. This was an American problem. That was view number 1. Secondly, the Germans always used huge amounts of factor VIII, much higher than Britain, from German donors. They had, apparently, they'd had little or no HIV. That was quoted. And then thirdly, there was a very understandable concern. We've spoken about inhibitors. About 10% of patients develop inhibitors, which makes the future treatment with factor VIII effectively impossible. And some doctors very reasonably said, I'm really worried about this because the heat treatment might alter the antigenic nature of factor VIII in the bottle, so that when it's injected into the patient, the antibodies, the patient's immune system might recognize the injection as being foreign for the first time and make an inhibitor. And this was a very serious, it would have been a very serious development, and it was perfectly reasonable to put up that as an argument. Having said all that and had this incredibly, I can't stress to you enough the difficulties and plus all the implementation of it, I had to persuade the patients who were anti-American. I had to, in the middle of a financial year, increase the budget by 50%. At some stage in the next day and a half, I'd like to talk to you about the way finances were arranged in haemophilia and priorities and things, because that's a particularly important thing. And we had all the logistics of getting unheat-treated supplies in, getting heat-treated supplies out. So it was just in terms of logistics, once you'd done that, it was very complicated. And you had other doctors saying to us at meetings, I don't know why you're doing this. Anyway, finally, very poignantly, although for a long time I thought this was just the most unimaginably difficult decision, I now realise, and this is quite a powerful thing to say, actually it was all probably irrelevant, because I now realise that nearly all of the patients had already been infected. And at some stage I'd like to talk to you about that data.
Absolutely, we will come to that.
But anyway, that was the heat treatment dialogue.
Can I just ask, sorry, that you mentioned two other doctors, so along with you and Professor Savage. I think you've named the Middlesex and Sheffield as the areas. Could you just let us know who the doctors were?
Yes, there's Professor Eric Preston, who you're due to be seeing, and Professor Sam Machin from the Middlesex. He was quite a small centre.
And did you consider heat-treated products other than Alpha? Were there other options available to you at that time?
No, that was the only one available. And we were very, very keen to get on with it as soon as possible. We made the decision, it seemed absolutely right, but difficult, and we absolutely wanted to get it done. So we started May 1984. There were then some supply problems, but from June 84, all of those 4 centres were using only heat-treated factor 8 and factor 9, and they did not get any more viral infections in those centres after those dates, whilst other centres, as we'll discuss, were going on using unheat-treated material all the way through till September the following year, a period of about 15 months or so.
And can I just ask before we break, again, Dr. Winter, in terms of the categories of patient who switched to heat-treated products in May of 1984, was that all of your patients? So those who had been on some form of NHS or cryoprecipitate, and presumably it wasn't those for whom DDAVP was the most appropriate treatment?
No, for DDAVP is fine. For everybody else, we were making a core statement. Any concentrate is unsafe. Because of the nature of concentrate manufacture, the vulnerability of a haemophiliac patient to get a virus is so strong with 20,000, whatever it is, donors, be it donor from voluntary donor or commercial donor. We'd convinced ourselves all at that moment in time you were very, very unwise to continue to treat any patient with a concentrate that had not had a step to inactivate a virus.
So if we leave aside von Willebrands and mild haemophiliacs for whom DDAVP was appropriate, all the rest of the patients, haemophilia A and haemophilia B.
And haemophilia B as well, even though there were no patients with AIDS, we felt as a principle, if it was in factor 8 concentrate, why shouldn't it be in factor 9 as well? We wanted everybody to switch.
I'll ask you a little about the process, but I note the time, sir. Is this a convenient moment for the afternoon break?
Well, it will be after I've asked one further question, if I may. You've described how difficult a decision it was. You've given credit to the arguments against that decision. Was there one factor in particular which made you decide the way you did, or not? And if so, what was it?
Well, I think the combination of these particular factors, I was totally sold up and had been since 1982 to the idea that AIDS was due to a transmissible agent. I then knew by the middle of 83 that that was the case because the virus had been identified. I knew then that that virus had been causing illness in a small number of American haemophiliacs, and by that stage a British haemophiliac. And I knew that the patients were incredibly vulnerable because they were receiving concentrate from thousands of donors. So if you added in all those little things, you had a pretty clear view. You had just lost confidence, if you ever had confidence, that concentrates were safe. And when historians in 50 years will write histories of haemophilia, they'll say concentrates brought unimaginable benefits to people with haemophilia for the first time. Home therapy, schools, work, exercise, etc., a normal life, with then a huge but the Achilles heel. It came from thousands of blood donors. If there was a virus in town, in blood, the haemophiliacs would get it.
Thank you very much.
So
Yes,
what-
we'll take a break until 3:45. Half an hour, I hope, is okay for you. 3:45, Doctor.